All right, so adversary emulation in OT environments. I think SANS did this on purpose. We're going to give them credit, right, Tim? Good job, Tim. Good job, Rob, on the scheduling, because we complement exactly the talk you just got, right? We were down there with going into PLCs. Now we're going to put the whole thing in context and talk about how do we look at that when we're doing risk assessments. Of course, we had to have our own bios and pictures.
Yeah, just quick introduction. So I'm a manager of security operations. I have cyber and physical, cloud, IT, OT. Like a lot of asset owners out there, we're highly converged. We're trying to find ways to scale, modernize our operations, and kind of just spread all that out.
I do stuff. All right, so we didn't really fit in the box there, did we?
So close.
So close, right? Scope is important.
Yeah.
That's what this slide is telling you.
Okay, so before we get into some of the content, we realize that SANS is a learning opportunity for a lot of people out there, both here and out on the internet. So we wanted to cover just a couple of common terms that are going to be important to understand as we dig into the actual content. So the first thing here on your slide is the Purdue model. Again, it's out of order, but the Purdue model is a way that a lot of us defenders have been conceptualizing our architecture and therefore our defense of our OT systems. It has been a great way for us to communicate essentially defense in depth, but we're going to challenge some of those assumptions here in just a little bit. It should spin to the next image. There you go. All right. And so the next item we want to just cover real quick is the ICS Kill Chain. So I think a lot of us are familiar with the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain and all that good stuff. Rob Lee and Mike Asante a long time ago wrote a paper extending the kill chain to include elements specifically related to OT. And so when we start to think about what attacks look like that impact or affect OT operations, you have to go and include the OT components of this kill chain. So we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And lastly, access versus impact. And this is going to be one of the main things that we touch upon throughout our talk is the malware or the adversary has multiple steps to get to your crown jewels. It's an iteration of access operations, ultimately trying to get to a place where they can impose impact. And that's where we start to get into some fuzzy areas of our adversary emulation techniques.
And that's also, of course, what we see strategically. When we look at the last 12 to 13 years of what's publicly available for critical infrastructure operations against, right? So we know who those are, Russia, Iran, China, that are conducting these operations. Why is it mostly looking at an iterative piece to access, not impact? Think about that. They are intentionally walking up to the line. And the best example, I think, where this starts to really push this is, we all saw the Oldsmar water hack, right? And what's interesting, right? That was not an amateur just coming into TeamViewer onto an HMI and saying, hey, I wonder what happens if I slide this thing up. That was somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. And they told that programmable logic controller to introduce a dangerous amount of lie into the system. Now, here's the thing. On the face of it, that sounds like a direct impact attack, right? I have actually caused something that could, in fact, lead to loss of human life or injury. However, if you look at how water processing actually works, that water that would have been treated that way goes into a storage that then is manually tested before it is released into the stream. So what does that mean? They were testing our response. They were seeing what could have happened. So it's important to recognize, of course, cyber does not sit in this isolation of just being an organizational challenge that each of us face in our enterprise, trying to get leadership to pay attention and understand, trying to convince the engineers on the operational technology side to take us seriously and recognize how the increased computerization in their environment has opened this aperture, but recognizing we're also working on this at a strategic level of very much what's going on in the world. So the Purdue model is the go-to reference architecture that all of us look at when we are designing the operational technology components, the convergence into IT, and then where IT fits in that scope. Here's the problem. The original intent of the Purdue model was looking at the timing elements of control systems. It's convenient to look at it as a way of enterprise architecture, but here's the fallacy. It gives you an intuitive sense of defense in depth. Look at all of those levels. More levels means more gates that an attacker has to cross. And the reality is that's not true. It basically breaking down, when we look at the attack phases of what an attacker is doing, there's only really 3 levels. Information technology. I love information technology because it is by definition the part of your company that is designed to be internet facing. A hacker can't hack what they can't touch. The internet changed that whole problem. I can wake up wherever I am in the world, eat my Wheaties, and go to town. Here's the second part of that. We all know an air gap is not an air gap is not an air gap, right? Everyone believes that, right? I've had people be like, well, I know in nuclear. No, guarantee you, there is always a point that something fails to be an air gap. Your IT is always connected somewhere to your OT environment. And that initial piece is right in the Purdue architecture, right? That's that part that we want to be DMZ'd for this. But here's the thing. Those are beachhead systems. Those are HMIs, those are DCSs, those are high-level systems that are there to manage, to monitor, and also to instruct. And what operating systems do they run? Pretty much the very similar operating systems, typically 2 generations and not patched from what you have in your enterprise IT environment. Think about that. So how I got there is also how I'm going to get in. And then we, of course, have where the literal rubber meets the road. This is part of what makes OT so interesting versus the more generic and abstract data of an information technology environment where physical things are happening. And at that lower level with programmable logic controllers, those things are just taking the commands that the beachheads give them. So from an attack perspective, IT is my great surface area that I'm getting in. I'm moving laterally into beachhead, and then I'm able to demonstrate most of what I'm going to be doing from there.
Yeah. This slide is really talking, we're already now going to try and start tying some of these things together, right? Access versus impact, identify where, as defenders, we took the Purdue model and we said, this is defense in depth to us, but really what does the attacker see? And then now with this roadmap, how can we start to do things that, help us improve our environment? And we're going to try and do some of this through adversary emulation.
So of course, why are we doing adversary emulation in operational technology environment? Ian, as somebody who can afford clothes, clearly you can afford software.
This is my kick. I refer to this as, this is where you're choosing your kickball team, right? For us on the defense side, we look at a eye chart like this and say, choose your fighter. Who are you going to bring to the schoolyard to help you defend your environment against the attacker? And as you can see, there's a huge amount of options out here. Some of them are good, some of them are less good. Some of them are good as long as you give it the right resources. Some are great if you have it tuned properly. There's a myriad of problems with each and every one. And we used to be, ICS and OT has gained a whole lot of mind share over the last 10 years, especially. And so now there's like specific categories that are dedicated directly to ICS and OT. So a few years ago, this idea of breach and attack simulation came out, and there's a handful of vendors out there in that space. And it was all about how do we test the efficacy of some of these tools that we've invested millions and millions of dollars in. But how do we do that in OT? So we have this emerging market where we have to just kind of trust what they are saying. Hey, we can help you stop X, attack X or vector Y or whatever. How do we know? Right? We've been working on testing just our IT stuff, but now we're investing huge amounts of money that our executive teams are asking, are we getting this value out of this investment? Well, how do we show them that? On top of that, not only are we working with our vendors and partners, really, I like to give vendors a hard time, but truly they're our partners and they help us solve problems. But what we're really trying to do on the defense side is we're trying to develop a culture of defense. And it starts with partnerships with our folks out in the field, like plant managers, INC techs, the people that are responsible at the end of the day for making sure that system is up and operational and delivering the service it's intended to deliver. And if you don't have a good relationship and you say, hey, Mr. Plant Manager, I'd like to come into your facility and I'd like to basically act like a hacker and do hacker stuff in your DCS. And they're going to say, you want to do what in my network? The truth is, every single one of our OT security journeys should have started years ago, if not a decade ago. It takes legwork. It takes relationship building. I love this picture of the donuts. This is real. This is what we do. We go out to a plant, we bring some donuts. There's always like a puppy dog donut or something like that. So one of our little tricks is we typically have a heart or a puppy dog donut, and the big tough plant worker that is stuck choosing the pink heart donut at the end gets a special prize, because no one ever chooses the puppy dog donut first. So in terms of using adversary emulation for the development of our security culture, we're looking to develop our internal talent as well. So that's on the cybersecurity side, that's in our INC tech side, that's on our OT side, wherever we can expose people to what an incident looks like in a safe and controlled manner, and they can see it in their own tools, they can respond using our own IRPs. We're not having to send them off to training. We're not putting them in some lab that doesn't translate to how we work in our environment. That's the kind of culture, when you have people comfortable using the tools and the things that you've invested in, that's where you get that culture of security. That's where now you can grow and expand and take advantage of this incredible talent that many of your organizations have.
So strange real-time tangent here, because I just recorded this podcast 2 hours ago. Dragos, in combination with Cybernation, is releasing a new podcast called Control Loop. And I was asked on the podcast, because I've done assessments for a long time at a lot of different places, what is the low-hanging fruit that you always see? And I think when people ask that question, they're typically looking for the nerd answer. Well, this is the technical thing. This is what I technically see. And this was my answer. That cultural divide, that relationship building, that understanding, that training, and that process is the biggest gap. And it is even folks like, not to give, he's awesome and he's pretty, but even them, there's still growth in the process maturity that they're doing it. So here's the thing. You can spend all of the money on those tools. And by the way, there's only 2 things to look at when you are evaluating a tool. Step 1 is trust. Do you trust that vendor? If you have any question about trust, don't do it. And here's the second part that's on you. You have to commit to what are you going to do to make that tool yours. Think about that. If the vendor says you don't need to do that, go back to the first point, don't trust them. You have to invest to make the tool yours. Security is contextual. There is no silver bullet out there. How many billions of dollars and lots of hours of smart people thinking about this problem have there been? And here we are, because your security is yours. Now, here's the other part, right? There was a tweet the other day where someone said, hey, the adversary gets a vote too. And I was like, you misspelled veto. The threat is what defines your security, not what you think you have. The threat is what defines your security. And whatever your stack is just their test matrix. So you don't have to put on the Adidas suit to truly get yourself into the mind of the attacker, but it doesn't hurt. So how do we take what we see out in the real world, that threat intelligence, and make it real so we can test, right? If security is the threat, how do I become the threat? And there are levels of this. Everybody at this point has heard the pyramid of pain, right? And this is mostly what you're living on down here, because it is really easy to identify a bad IP address. And let's think about that. How long ago was that IP address bad before you find out? How bad was that domain, that particular hash? Do you know how easy it is to change a hash? All I have to do is add a 0. It's now a new platform that your defenses can't see. So we need to be getting into the behavioral components and really breaking down what exactly are the tactics, techniques, and procedures. What are those behaviors? Because that's what's going to key you in on what happens tomorrow. Because when you look at attack chains, most of the attack chains overlap. Typically, access is always a given. And then what they do once they're in your environment is pretty much mostly the same, with just some novel introductions to do something particularly different. So if you really do focus on this over time, I'm not going to promise you will stop 0-day, because you never will, and you don't really need to. But you are going to start to detect attacks that haven't been seen before in your environment.
Yeah, so what does this look like in practice? So this is an exercise my team went through where we deconstructed the ECANS ransomware based upon threat intelligence reports using the SCI threat emulation tool or adversary emulation tool. Because what we realize is we get a lot of threat intel from a lot of really great sources, and a lot of stuff overlaps, but there's bits and pieces from each vendor that adds nuance or adds some specificity that gives you that little bit of an edge where you can now question your environment whether or not you're even capable of identifying, detecting, and responding to whatever the threat is. So we took ECANS. I think one of the reasons is we saw our anti-malware vendor on the list of processes that the ECANS ransomware was designed to go and shut down. So we're like, hey, this is a great use case. Because I don't know if anyone here in the crowd has ever gotten this where a big report comes out, a threat intelligence report comes out, the Wall Street Journal publishes an article, and you have an executive come to you and say, hey, are we okay? And like, what are you supposed to do? You're just like, yeah, I mean, as far as you know, we're okay. But what we want to do is we want to move beyond that and say, yeah, we think we're okay, and here's why. And here's some actual measurements and saying we took this, we deconstructed it like a fancy chef on South Beach. We've deconstructed the ransomware, whatever the intel report is, piled it back together, validated our tools. We know where we see it. We know our gaps. We have found our opportunities to improve. And that's what we were able to do with the ECANS ransomware. And it was kind of like this eureka moment where we said, holy smokes, we don't have to sit there and wait for signatures to come out or the IOCs to come out. We can actually go test against these different TTPs that are harder and harder to replicate. To Bryson's point, IPs, hashes, they're nothing, right? But if you see some of these specific activities related to MITRE ATT&CK, wow, now you can actually start to move that needle a little bit.
In fact, throwing you under the bus here because we didn't script this part, is just this past weekend, right? 3-day weekend. What has to happen on a 3-day weekend? Well, a major 0-day has to get dropped. Yeah. And so Kevin Beaumont found Felina, which if you want to know where that name came from, there was a string that tied to the area code for that city in Italy. But and then Jake Williams followed up and did a bunch of research on exactly what MSDT, which is the Microsoft diagnostic tool that is embedded in these platforms, and how it worked. And you were able to put that in context because, right, GRC sees this, yeah, starts freaking out. Yeah. And you can now go, well, what does that mean? Yeah. Because a vulnerability by itself doesn't mean it's a vulnerability to you. Again, context, right? So I did have to speak for you, but you just did that.
Like, if your vulnerability management tool or whatever starts kicking out problems saying, oh no, like everything's burning down. And then your ops guys are saying, oh yeah, no, we've already ran this scenario. We know exactly what this will look like if it happens for real. We've tested and validated against these systems. We've got some other, now we have some enhancement things that we're doing. We're working on it, right? Because I don't think any reasonable risk manager, kind of speaking to JD's point, talk about executives and understanding the language of risk, they're not going to expect instantaneous corrections. Like, they understand that a lot of this stuff takes work, but it needs to be intentional. And that's what adversary emulation can get for you if you start to leverage the threat intel piece as well.
And just last piece on this, because everybody likes to turn an easy little matrix like that into a checkbox. Do not play bingo card. Yeah. Do not run a threat emulation and do those techniques and be like, boss, we've solved initial access for forever. Lateral movement, done. Yeah. Okay, can we all agree? Please don't do that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, and here's just some other examples of what we were running. We were testing some very specific behaviors that were written up in threat intel. If you just start going to pull in reports from the ECANS ransomware, you'll see like, hey, here's where we validated that the local admin rights were set properly. The access was denied. We saw that enumerate or get user profile. Some of these behaviors we would expect to be successful because at the end of the day, users still have to use their endpoints. Like, they're not going to be 100% locked down, but knowing where they win and where they lose can put your ops teams like in an advanced position to remediate and detect that threat. And then the next one, Yeah, right. And so this is just more examples of iteration, right? Adversary emulation can't just be a one and done. We're checking the box for the auditor or whatever, right? We gave everyone VMware Workstation, and we have gold images of our devices and in different configurations. So sometimes with an EDR, sometimes with just antivirus, sometimes with different tools, right? We want to know all the different configurations and variations and what to expect when and where. And it doesn't have to be overly burdensome if you just do a little bit at a time. You're not going to solve all your organization's problems in an afternoon. It's just kind of continuous low-level effort. It's that grind. It's that operational grind that you use to get better. Okay. I think this one's you.
Yeah, well, so iterative intelligence ops, right? We talked about that strategically, that's what we've been seeing from the obvious nation state actors, but it's also what's happening in a particular breach, right? When I land and get shell initially in an IT environment, I don't actually know exactly where I am as an attacker. I know I'm on your box, but I don't know what that box means in the greater context. Am I where I want to be? Most of the time, no. So what do? I do iterative intelligence. I try to collect things. I try to figure out where I am. Where do I want to go? If OT is the final vector that I'm trying to get to, how do I get there, right? The average IT box is not just magically hooked into an OT environment. So where are those points that I can find to cross over? And then that's what I'm going to be doing. Now, here's the good news for you. That is where the threat is noisy, right? I can't hide on the wire. I go to ones and zeros just like everybody does. Now, what I'm going to try to do is blend into that traffic. And so this is one of the things you're going to find over time as you're doing threat emulation, is you're going to start to discover, what is my baseline behavior? What are my baseline parameters? What does normal look like? Because it's the deviation from normal where the threat exists. And that's how you'll find them.
Yeah, so let's start the journey into OT. So if we go and we accept some of the lessons from the ICS Kill Chain, we believe that OT attacks are going to emanate from IT. That is the most likely scenario. And we don't necessarily want to try and deal with, like, these kind of odd ends or stunt hack stuff. We're like, well, technically, like, you could, RF transmission into a keyboard or whatever, right? We want to say, what is the likeliest approach for malware to get into our OT environment? For many organizations, it's going to be through the IT environment. So for our adversary emulation to start that journey, and again, as a way to communicate and form relationships with the rest of the business, we start on the edge and start working in. And so, it doesn't have to be too high speed. I think a lot of us deal with security issues in our IT environments all the time. People generally understand that, oh, the bad stuff is out on the internet. And so the networks closest to the internet are most likely to be negatively impacted from security issues. And we can also look at, say, things like the Oldsmar water treatment facility attack and say, hey, here's an example of some remote access problems. Like we see it in the news. And so you can go replicate and say, if we had TeamViewer in our environment, would we know? If someone was hopping in, not necessarily directly to our control system, but maybe just to the IT environment to take over a server, would we know? And so you can start using some like ripped from the headline stuff to test your environment. And again, to communicate to your organization how a lot of these attacks work.
Findings?
I mean, I think our findings, here will probably match what a lot of people find, is that there's always opportunities for visibility improvements. It's hard seeing everything. And there are some things that are out there that the adversary is using, like unmanaged PowerShell. I know that's a big one that comes to mind. And if you're not looking at your ability to detect and respond to unmanaged PowerShell, it's probably something you should ask your ops folks to go start to look into. PowerShell is a wonderful tool for attackers because it is ubiquitous. It is in the IT environment. Windows is in the OT environment. It's all there. It makes system administration really easy. And all the living off the land stuff just becomes fairly straightforward.
We like to be lazy. I'm not going to bring my own code if I can use yours.
Efficient. We see
efficient.
On the corporate side, we use efficient, and it's not lazy.
I'm wearing shorts. I'm in Florida.
Okay, so what does that look like here? You know, as we start to tie some of this behavior to the Purdue and to kill chain, right? We're staying simply up in the ICS kill chain, or excuse me, on the IT part of the ICS kill chain or stage one. You know, again, like this is the start of that discussion and that journey that you can share with the rest of the org as you start to work in. Next one, beachhead operation. So at this point, we've established, hey, I've got interactive access. I've established C2, assume compromise, and now I can start to go touch things. And I can get into level, you know, 3, level 3.5, you know, whatever. We iterate and we assume compromise at some level. We assume at some level, the adversary is going to be able to get in. And now it's about detecting pivots. It's about detecting presence. It's about detecting the further ingress into your environment. So how do we test things like this? Well, I think your jump server is a pretty straightforward way to go test out whether or not your security or connectivity between these zones is effective. If something happened to your jump server, would you be able to tell? Can you trust your AV? You know, can you trust your EDR? What if it's living off a LAN? What if it's account compromised? There's all sorts of different iterations that you can test out in this environment. And when we think about like the findings specifically, I think, you know, some of the big ones that stood out to us was ACL management. I think that's always been kind of a tough one. I think if you're using your routers as firewalls or saying, hey, you know, only allow connections from this IP or that IP or whatever, good luck managing that at scale. I think that's one that I've seen around before. And then I think the other big finding is when you start poking around at these environments, that's when you start to get subject matter experts starting to come together. And so when people start touching these boxes and engaging with the environment that has multiple stakeholders, this has now become an opportunity for us to improve the way we bring people into a potential incident, right? Because security knows everything that's going on. We're the ones running the simulation. Even if it's a test environment, there's probably people in there poking around. Bring those folks in so they can see it from the get-go. And so, the finding doesn't necessarily have to be like a tool weakness. Maybe it's a process weakness. Maybe it's a communication weakness, or not even a weakness, just an opportunity to do better. And I think that's probably some language that helps tell that story a little better. Okay. And this thing is driving me crazy. All right. So the
it's the threat on stage.
Yeah, right. Again, this is just a graphical representation of, assume compromise, and you're working through the DMZ, you're hopping into historian. Now you're into the SCADA server. We're now starting to rapidly approach that stage 2 area. Now, level 2, does anything that feels like a special place for the adversary? Bryson, what do you think?
Yeah, so this is where, of course, we are able to make things happen. Now, the balance of access and impact is access implies impact. What I mean by that is we, of course, can't affect production. We can't affect operations directly. Why? Well, because actual bad things happen and you've turned a test into a real world. Don't ever do that to yourself. And so let the access, let the touch then imply more of the perspective of, again, going to the presentation that was right before us, recognizing the hardening and that now complementing what would happen in a threat emulation operation with my access means these things would happen.
All right. So we focused on access, but really what we do want to get into OT. We want to get to those crown jewels because we have this, these fancy OT security tools that we've implemented. We have a significant risk and a threat to our environment. We need to provide some assurance up to leadership that our architecture is defensible, that our tooling is appropriate, that we're ready to take on these emerging threats as they come. So how do we do that, right? So from a planning perspective, the access operation is kind of a rinse and repeat of what we've already been doing. Now, the closer you get down to your sensors and the PLCs and things like that, the more planning is required and the more partnerships required. Again, like this is where that decade of partnership that we've all been working on with our asset owners and our stakeholders, this is where all that stuff starts to pay off. because they begin to trust you a little bit and say, oh yeah, like we're maybe in an outage, or, we have this going on. So this may be an opportune time for you to come test out. Or we have a lab that we just stood up that really no one else knows about, but come on in because it's a duplication of one of our units. Awesome, right? Impact, I think a lot of us are going to be a long ways away from that. No matter how good your relationship is, if you're talking about throwing code onto a PLC or doing something like that, I think everyone's going to be real iffy, because that's a big ask. And so we're going to get to impact just here in a minute. But we want to be able to emulate, pipe dream. We want to be able to emulate Indestroyer 2. We want to be able to get to that point right at level 2 where we start to have the ability to do true impact operations. And we want to be able to measure detection and prevention, right? We want to be able to say, how far can the adversary get without me knowing? And can I just detect? Can I prevent? Are there opportunities to raise either one of those? Okay. So we've established, so going back to our little chart here, we've established, I think you start clicking through, right? Oh, yep. There you go. Yep. So there you go. We're now we're into the 3, going down to 2. And now we're ready for stage 2, deliver, install, execute the ICS attack. We're ready to do this. Again, what's the plant manager going to tell us? Nope, nope, nope. Not going to happen. Not in their environment. So what do we do instead? There you go. How do we test impact operations? And I wish I had a really fancy, cool, innovative way to do that. But really, as far as we know, there's really only 2 ways that we've even been able to think about this in a way that's realistic in our environment. And it all centers around building a lab. So if you don't have a lab, I will highly encourage you to take advantage of them. You can go buy one of these programmer controller system sets. You can get them for fairly cheap. You can bring some of your INC techs in, some of your other plant folks in. You can just basically have like this little lab build out party. And then, once you have that, you have probably made some friends that know a thing or two about the control systems in your environment. And you can throw whatever, cyber junk at it that you possibly want, because who cares if you break this little, PLC in a box. And these are also really great to have to like take on road shows to your other plants and other facilities, because then you can show what an attack on these devices actually looks like. And it may be a little bit of stunt hacking, but it is like a kind of a revolutionary or a eureka moment for some of these folks out in the field to see, hey, that thing was spinning, and then this guy like hit a button, and then all of a sudden it's not spinning, and like lights just turned off and no one knows why, right? It's kind of a neat thing. So here, this is an example of kind of what we would see in a isolated lab environment where we're attempting to, in the ICS MITRE, impair a process control. So we have the adversary actually operating the environment. We have some sort of tap or span or something in the network infrastructure, and we're sending it out to some sort of test unit or some sort of like telemetry log or something like that. Because then what we'll do is we'll take that and say, did we see this bad happen? And then we'll just have to work backwards from there.
One piece of advice that's not something you're going to think about until it happens to you. Plan your budget like you're going to break something. You will brick a PLC. You will brick something, right? These things can be very sensitive. And when that happens, it's good to have already planned for that in the budget, so you didn't just bring your entire lab operation to its own, standstill because your impact test.
Yeah, then the other way to potentially do this, and I put level 1 in here. This is still most likely a lab environment, because again, good luck going from level 2 into level 1, shooting actual impact operations or impact emulations. But being able to act as the adversary, like Bryson was talking about, where you have a attacker at level 2 now moving down to level 1, using things like LOLBAS or doing discovery operations or things like that. You need to know whether or not you can see those things, because that's really, like, if we go back to the kill chain, that's really your last line of defense, is that barrier between, it's that engineering workstation, it's that HMI to your PLCs and RTUs and things like that.
LOLBAS, living off the land, binaries and scripts. It's whatever code or function is already there to do whatever it's supposed to do, or whatever makes your life more convenient can be used against you. So closing this all real quickly, we've been talking about culture. There are two kinds of companies. Leadership buys in, leadership doesn't buy in. They don't buy in, don't beat your head against the wall, or use baby steps of these kinds of processes to educate them and get that buy-in. Recognize the IT versus OT is still culturally divergent and that we're working on bringing more closer operation. And your ability to emulate threat is its own capability that you have to recognize beyond your operational maturity.